Today, you're going to hear the story of a mother who gave everything for her children, and in return, received only abandonment. How did we get to this point? And more importantly, how can we prevent this from happening to those we love most? In this video, we'll dive deep into the emotions, the memories, and the unspoken words of a mother who, despite her pain, still holds love in her heart. Stay with us until the end, because this story isn't just about her. It's about all of us. Get ready to listen, reflect, and maybe change something within yourself. In the quiet suburbs of an ordinary town, there stood a modest yet lively home. Floral curtains swayed gently in the morning breeze as the smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen. This was the home of Margaret, a 68-year-old widow who had been alone for over a decade, dedicating every moment of her life to her 3 children, James, Lisa, and Michael. Margaret wasn't wealthy. Her greatest asset was the house she and her late husband had worked so hard to buy over 30 years. Within those walls, countless stories were built. Birthdays, laughter-filled Christmases, and long dinner-table conversations. For Margaret, that house wasn't just a physical place. It was a symbol of safety, love, and a family legacy. Her children grew up there, and over time each one set off on their own path. James became a real estate agent, Lisa opened a small cafe in town, and Michael, the youngest, was still trying to find his way in life. They visited their mother occasionally, but as the years went by, those visits became fewer and farther between. Even so, Margaret never complained. She always believed her children's love was unshakable, no matter the distance or time apart. Every morning she'd brew an extra cup of coffee, hoping one of them might show up unexpectedly. She never stopped smiling when answering the phone, thinking it might be one of them saying, "Mom, I'm coming to visit you today." But as happens in many families, things started to change. Financial struggles arose, difficult conversations were avoided, and what once felt like an unbreakable family bond began to fray. It all came to a head the day Margaret's 3 children gathered to make a life-changing decision to sell their mother's home. "It's just a house, Mom. You can live somewhere else. This will be better for everyone." Those words would echo in Margaret's mind for a long time. She tried to argue, tried to hold her children's hands and remind them of the moments they'd shared there, but it was in vain. Margaret was about to lose not just her house, but something far more precious, the certainty that she would never be alone. The day Margaret left her home was marked by a deafening silence. The furniture that once told stories was carried away by strangers, and the bare walls felt cold and distant. In the backyard, where she used to plant flowers every spring, all that remained were hurried footprints from the final sale. Her children were there, but they weren't the same. James spoke about numbers and contracts, Lisa avoided eye contact, and Michael, who could barely hide his guilty expression, stayed silent. Margaret held a small suitcase with her most precious belongings, a few photos, a handmade wool sweater, and a worn-out Bible, a gift from her late husband. "Mom, this is what's best for all of us. You'll adjust soon enough," James said, his voice sounding more like he was trying to convince himself than his mother. Margaret didn't respond. She simply looked at each of her children, one by one, searching their eyes for a flicker of the love they once shared. But all she found were hurried faces, as if they were eager to close this uncomfortable chapter. That afternoon, Margaret was taken to a small apartment in the city center. It was cramped, stuffy, and bore no resemblance to her former home. There was no garden, no smell of fresh coffee in the morning, and no family photos on the walls, just silence and solitude. The first few weeks were the hardest. Margaret spent hours staring out the window, watching strangers rush by. She tried calling her children a few times, but her calls often went to voicemail or were answered hastily. "Sorry, Mom, I'm busy right now. I'll call you later," they would say. But later never came. For the first time, Margaret truly felt the weight of abandonment. The house wasn't just a structure made of bricks, it was the invisible thread that still connected her to her children. And now, that thread had snapped. Alone in a small, distant apartment, Margaret found herself with no answers, no shoulder to cry on, and most of all, no hope that things would ever return to the way they were before. The days in Margaret's small apartment began to blur into an endless, monotonous sequence. The clock on the wall ticked rhythmically, but the silence was so deep that the sound seemed to echo throughout the entire space. Mornings arrived without expectation, and nights brought only a heavier loneliness. Margaret woke up early every day, just as she used to in her old home. She made herself a cup of coffee and placed a second cup on the table out of habit. She sat by the window, watching the world outside, trying to find some meaning in her new reality. The phone remained silent, and when it did ring, it was never a familiar voice on the other end. Her children's visits became increasingly rare. At first, they said they were busy with work. Later, the excuses became less clear until, finally, they stopped offering excuses altogether. When Margaret tried calling, her calls were met with hurried responses or ignored entirely. "Mom, I can't talk right now. I'll call you later," James said. "Sorry, I'm with a customer," Lisa murmured. Michael stopped showing up altogether. Margaret began talking to herself, mostly at night. She held old photographs of her children and whispered their names as if doing so might bring them back. Sometimes she went out for walks around the neighborhood, but no one seemed to notice her presence. She was just another elderly woman wandering alone, shoulders slumped, eyes distant. One day, Margaret decided to visit Lisa's cafe unannounced. When she arrived, she saw her daughter deeply focused on serving customers. Margaret stood there, waiting to be noticed. But Lisa only gave her a quick glance, a brief wave, and continued working. No words, no hug. Margaret left the cafe with tears in her eyes and a crushing pain in her chest. Maybe it's my fault. Maybe I did something wrong, she thought. The loneliness began to affect her health. Margaret started losing weight. Her hands trembled more than usual, and her nights were filled with sleepless hours. A deep sadness slowly consumed her, like a shadow that refused to leave. There were days when Margaret could barely get out of bed. On others, she tried to keep herself busy by folding clothes that were already folded, organizing empty drawers, or cleaning shelves that didn't need cleaning. She needed something to make her feel useful, to remind herself that she was still alive. But there were also small moments of hope. A woman in her building named Diane began visiting her occasionally. Diane was also a widow, and the two started sharing stories and tears. Diane listened patiently, held Margaret's trembling hands and said, "You're not alone, Margaret. I'm here." Those moments felt like tiny sparks of light in the darkness surrounding Margaret's life. But when Diane left, the emptiness returned. The most painful truth for Margaret was that she still loved her children unconditionally. Despite the pain, despite the abandonment, she never stopped hoping for a phone call, an unexpected visit, or a simple message saying, "Mom, I love you." She clung to that fragile hope as if it were an invisible thread still connecting her to her children. Even when everything seemed lost, Margaret still believed that maybe one day they would come back. And so day after day, she kept waiting. The hours in Margaret's small apartment continued to pass slowly, but her mind seemed to drift into the past more and more often. She remembered James's first steps, Lisa's sweet smile, and Michael's soft voice when he was a child. Moments that for her felt like they had happened just yesterday, but for her children seemed to have faded into distant memories. Where did it all go wrong? Margaret asked herself night after night. She couldn't understand how the unconditional love she had given her children had turned into distance and silence. Was it something left unsaid? A gesture misunderstood? Or had the modern world, with its relentless demands, simply stolen her children's time and attention? Despite the silent tears that ran down her face as she thought about it, Margaret held no resentment. Her heart, though broken, was still filled with love for those three faces she carried deep in her soul. If only I could see them one more time, tell them I love them and that I'm here waiting for them. How many mothers and fathers, just like Margaret, are sitting in small, silent rooms, staring at faded photos, waiting for a visit that never comes? This isn't just the story of one abandoned mother. It's the story of thousands of parents around the world who, after years of sacrifice, are left behind. But it doesn't have to be this way. There's still time to change, to make that phone call, to say sorry, or simply to show up at their door with a smile. Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that heal the deepest wounds. If you still have your parents around, cherish them. If you can hear their voices, listen closely. If you can hug them, do it tightly, because time, once lost, never comes back. Margaret didn't hope for expensive gifts, vacations, or grand gestures. She just wanted to be remembered, heard, and above all, loved. If there's one lesson this story teaches us, it's that the love we owe our parents should never be pushed aside, because in the end, they only want one thing: the certainty that they will never be forgotten. How many times have we put off that important phone call? How many visits have we delayed, believing there will always be more time? Margaret's story is a painful reminder that time is relentless and missed opportunities rarely return. Right now, as you watch this video, there are parents, grandparents, and people who dedicated their lives to their children, sitting in silence, waiting for a message, a phone call, or even a surprise visit. They don't want expensive gifts or grand events. They just want you, your voice, your presence, the warmth of a sincere hug. Pick up your phone right now, call your mother, your father, or that figure who cared for you when you needed it most. If you can, go visit them. Don't wait for tomorrow to bring more time, because tomorrow is a promise that isn't always kept. If you know someone like Margaret, someone facing loneliness, reach out. Sometimes a simple, "How are you?" can light up the day of someone who hasn't heard that question in far too long. And if you're a son or daughter who has drifted away for any reason, remember this: it's never too late to come back. An apology, a kind gesture, a sincere word. All these have the power to rebuild bonds that once seemed lost. Our parents don't need much to be happy. They just need to know they still matter to us. This story doesn't end with Margaret. It continues with each of us. Now, the choice is in your hands. What will you do with this opportunity? Margaret still looks at the door every morning. She still prepares 2 cups of coffee, and her heart still races every time the phone rings, because even after everything, she still has hope. Hope to hear those simple but powerful words: "Mom, I love you. I'm here." This story isn't just about Margaret. It's about thousands of parents who, at some point in their lives, were left behind. But it's also a story about redemption, about second chances, and about the strength of love that never gives up. If this video touched you, don't let this message stop here. Pick up your phone, make that call, plan that visit, because tomorrow might be too late. The greatest gift you can give your parents isn't money or a luxurious home. It's your time, your presence, and your sincere love. If you believe this message can help others, share this video. Leave a comment, tell your story, and most importantly, take action. Thank you for being here, for listening to Margaret's story, and above all, for being willing to make a difference. We'll see you in the next video.